Hello, students. I hope you are doing well. As always, we have finished our discussion of the apology of Socrates' defense. In other words, as far as we are concerned, he has been found guilty, he has been sentenced to death, and that brings us to the Crito, right? Because in this dialogue, Socrates is sitting in a jail cell and his friend Crito comes to visit him, right? And they have a discussion about justice, basically about whether Socrates should escape, more specifically. Once again, I am using the Cooper and Grube translation from the Five Dialogues book, so I've put that right here on the first slide for you. Okay. Occasionally, students ask me about the pronunciation of Crito. Typically, if you look it up, this is definitely true in the Wikipedia. If you look it up in some large dictionary that might actually contain this name, Crito is usually the first pronunciation listed. Crito probably sounds more like ancient Greek, but we don't need to say the name in the way the ancient Greeks said it. Crito is a pretty widely accepted pronunciation, and I'm used to it, so I'm going to keep saying it. Okay, we've got some notes here to think about. It is strange that Socrates ended up being in jail for a month. Usually, if an Athenian was sentenced to death, that person was executed pretty quickly. It just so happens that a state galley, a ship, was away just after Socrates' trial ended. So this is a ship that leaves every year to go on a mission to the island of Delos, which is sacred to Apollo, which is, an interesting coincidence. And they perform some rituals there. I'm not sure exactly what they do. Then the ship has to come back, and only after the ship gets back to Athens can someone be executed. It would be impious, apparently, right, to execute someone while the sacred galley is away. So this is just an interesting accident of fate, Socrates gets to kind of hang out and talk to people while he's waiting to be executed. And when the dialogue opens, this ship has been spotted at Cape Sunium in Attica, which is the Greek peninsula. So it's not at Athens yet, but it's on that Greek peninsula. It's been seen there. So it will get to the Piraeus soon, and that's the name of Athens port, the Piraeus. Okay, so Socrates has been hanging out, but he's running out of time, so Crito really, really wants him to go and is feeling pretty urgent about it. There's an interesting nod to Socrates' conventional piety here, right? Because Socrates says he's had this dream. A woman clad in white has come to him in the dream and said, "On the third day you shall arrive in fertile Phthia." Right, so Crito is a bit freaked out and says, "They're going to kill you tomorrow because the ship is going to get here today." Socrates is pretty calm and says, "Well, not tomorrow, but it seems like I'll be killed the day after tomorrow because I had this dream." Right? And it said on the third day, not the second day, I will arrive in fertile Phthia. Right? And it's a reference to the Iliad, right? But we don't need to get into that too much. The point is, Plato seems to be portraying Socrates here as conventionally pious. Okay, so Crito really wants Socrates to leave. He makes some initial appeals that Socrates doesn't really care about. Hey, if you don't escape from prison, I will lose a friend the like of whom I'll never find again. In other words, you're unique, and I'll never find someone like you, right? A friend like you if you end up dead, which seems true. Socrates is pretty unusual. And my reputation will be tarnished, says Crito. People will think I cared more about money than I did about you, my friend, right? They'll think I'm stingy. Okay, Socrates is not impressed with any of this. He says, well, this is reputational stuff, right? Reputation is the opinion of the many about you. And you know that Socrates doesn't care about the opinion of the many very much, right? The few are experts in any given field, not the many. So Socrates tends to be dismissive of the opinion of the many. And he says, reasonable people. That's the few, by the way. Only a few are reasonable. Reasonable people will believe that things happened as they really did, that we acted as we really did. Crito says we have to care about the opinion of the many. They can put us to death. Socrates says, in line with what we already know about him, well, that's not the worst thing that could happen to you. The worst thing is that you could be made foolish. That would be a very great harm. That seems to mean, in this context, being scared into wrongdoing, specifically, right? So escape seems like a problematic action on the face of it. Would it really be wrong? Well, that's partly what the dialogue is about, so we don't want to answer that question yet. But clearly Socrates is suggesting that it looks wrong, probably is, though we haven't done the analysis yet. Maybe they did on previous days, and they're going to go over it again. But anyway, that would be a great harm, as opposed to dying. Just being so scared by what the many are capable of that you do something unjust, something that ends up harming your soul. And so Socrates wants to avoid that, of course. Once Crito has been rebuffed, he pretty quickly comes around to the sort of consideration that Socrates will be interested in, right? He knows Socrates might be worried about his friends. He says, "Don't worry, and I can keep you safe. Your friends will be okay." But the main thing that Socrates is going to care about, as Crito seems to realize, is justice, right? So Crito does try to argue that it would be unjust of you, Socrates, to stay in jail until you get executed. It's just of you to escape. That would actually be the just thing to do. Conventionally, we might think you have to take your punishments, but hey, as Crito says elsewhere, the jury wronged you, so in this case, it's just to escape and get away from the punishment that they want to inflict on you. Okay. So there are these four considerations that have to do with justice. Let's go over these. Number one, you would be abandoning your life when you could preserve it, right? That's not treating life with, significant respect. It's unfair to Socrates specifically, or in other words, it's unjust to Socrates, right? Unfairness and injustice are roughly the same thing. So it can be easy to talk about fairness instead of justice, right? It's more natural to say it's unfair to Socrates to just give up his life when he could preserve it, the verdict itself was unfair, therefore it's unfair of Socrates to be killed. Okay. Number two, you're playing into your enemy's hands here. You're kind of letting the bad guys win. Presumably that's unfair to all the good guys, right? Which I'm sure includes Socrates and Crito as far as Crito is concerned, right? So that's unfair or unjust. Number three, what about your children? You would be abandoning them by letting yourself be killed. That's unfair to them or unjust to them. Number four, you're taking the easy way out here, right? You could be brave. You could face the situation bravely, but you're just chickening out. That's an odd thing for Crito to say, but that is what he's saying. By sitting here in this jail cell and waiting to die, you're being kind of a coward, right? So presumably, again, that's unfair to Socrates. Here he has an opportunity to exercise virtue and he's not exercising it. So he's missing out because he's made a bad decision, right? He could get to be brave, but he won't be. And then the issue of reputation seems to come up again. You'll make your friends look like cowards, right? But Socrates has already dealt with that. But now it's framed in terms of what's fair and what's unfair. Well, it's unfair to them. Okay, is Socrates moved? well, what do you think? Okay, so Socrates responds to Crito by saying, hey, let's go over some of our prior agreements. There are principles and arguments that we have agreed on in the past that are relevant here. Let's go over them again and see if anything is different. Socrates is concerned that he might lose some integrity here. He might, well, we've already said he might be scared to die, whether he realizes that consciously or not. He might make a mistake and do something foolish. So again, we see the paradox of Socrates. He's actually the one that's calm and seems to be facing his death pretty well, but he asks Crito, would you please look out for me by making sure we're objective and we don't get scared into agreeing to things that we shouldn't agree to. So anyway, let's look over these principles we've agreed on in the past and see if they still hold or if there's some new consideration that would make us toss something out. Okay. So first of all, Crito and Socrates have agreed in the past that, well, we shouldn't listen to just any opinions. Well, that sounds plausible. Okay. Which ones should we listen to? Well, the good ones, not the bad ones. Okay, pretty sensible. And then they agree that the good opinions are those of the wise and the bad opinions are those of the foolish. And that sounds an awful lot like, hey, we should listen to the experts. And they are the few, and we should disregard what the many have to say, because in any given area, the many are lacking expertise, right? So this is very familiar. This sounds like Socrates from the Apology, right? So if it sounds familiar to us, it should sound even more familiar to Crito, who's known Socrates a long time. So it's easy for them to agree on this point. And when Socrates gives an argument for it, it will even sound more like this idea that we need to listen to the experts. Okay. Number two, Socrates and Crito have agreed in the past that the good life is more important than merely living. That sounds sensible as well. maybe not everybody agrees, but it sounds sensible, right? Some people think life has absolute value regardless of the quality of that life. That's not really a typical Greek view, it seems. So this is somewhat conventional. The third thing they agree on is not so conventional, but this one is somewhat conventional. We want to pursue the good life, not just life. And then the good life must at least involve living honorably and justly, right? So then if that's true, there's no point in doing something unjust so that Socrates can continue to live, right? He's pursuing the good life, not mere life. If he does something unjust to save his life, well, he's now forfeited the good life, right? And so that violates this principle that they've agreed on in the past. Number three, there's an issue about who is harmed by one's injustice or by one's wrongdoing. Okay, and this is where it gets a little unconventional, which is why Socrates kind of badgers Crito and says, "Look, do you agree or not?" Like a lot of people wouldn't agree. So do you agree, Crito? Are you sure? So according to Socrates and Crito, they've agreed in the past. They agree again in the text. Wrongdoing is in every way shameful and harmful to the wrongdoer. Okay, so that I just want to point out that's not the usual view, right? If you steal a candy bar from a convenience store, you might figure that you have benefited and the convenience store has been harmed, right? They've lost a candy bar, they didn't get any money for it, right? So they're out some of their inventory, they'll have to replenish it, it's going to cost them something, right? So you've gained as the wrongdoer and the victim of the wrongdoing has lost. That is not what Socrates and Crito are saying. They're saying wrongdoing is not just shameful but harmful to the wrongdoer, and as I've already said, Socrates presses Crito on this. Do you really believe this? Crito says yes. We've got an argument coming up. There's an argument that supports all three principles, so okay, it's counterintuitive, it's in need of argument. Let's get there in a second here, but let's look at the implication of the third principle first. Well, if wrongdoing is always shameful and harmful to the wrongdoer, then we can't even do wrong in retaliation. And that's part of what makes this unconventional. Most ancient Greeks wouldn't agree with this. As far as I understand, they would say, get vengeance, get revenge. If somebody's wronged you, wrong them in return. Socrates is saying, well, wrongdoing is always wrong. That somebody wronged you doesn't make it okay for you to wrong them. Okay? And then it follows as well that we must stick to our just agreements, even though the consequences could be severe, right? To renege on a just agreement, that would seem to be wrongdoing, right? And then you mustn't do it even in retaliation. So yeah, you got to stick to your just agreements. And of course, what we're building up to here is Socrates will claim that he's made an agreement with the city of Athens to obey their laws. Okay, so what's the argument for all of this? The argument is based on analogy. Socrates likes to argue from analogy. I think we know that as well. Okay, so imagine there's an athlete who's in training right? And so this person is doing really strenuous stuff. Maybe this person does the pommel horse, right? For some reason, the pommel horse event seemed to stand out in the most recent Olympics. There was a pommel horse athlete that people got excited about. Well, anyway, easy to get injured doing the pommel horse. You're moving really fast. You're holding yourself up by your arms in a way that we don't normally do. You could easily throw yourself off the pommel horse. You could get injured on these bars that are on the horse. Well, okay. I think there are bars. Now I'm just wondering. I'm not a pommel horse expert, actually. Seems like you use bars to get up. And anyway, it's hard and you're going fast and you could definitely hurt yourself. So you've got to train for the event. You've got to approach it in the right way. You got to listen to your coach. You've got to listen to your trainer, right? You might develop an injury, and then the coach might say you'd better take a couple weeks off. Maybe you have a doctor, a physician on hand who helps the team, and the doctor says take a couple weeks off. Should you listen? Should Mr. Pommel Horse listen? Yeah, right. I mean, as Socrates and Crito say, if you don't listen, you could harm your body, you could corrupt your body. In other words, you could get some kind of permanent, somewhat debilitating injury. Your quality of life would be impaired. So I think, their statement that life wouldn't be worth living is a bit extreme, but we could see what they're getting at. You really could, in this kind of difficult event where people are really pushing themselves to their limits, and it's, you've got to compete against these other world-class athletes. Again, you're moving fast. The equipment is hard. You really could get a debilitating injury and experience chronic pain, and your quality of life is degraded. And then, there might be a question at least whether life is worthwhile at that point. Do you really want to live with a degraded body? Well, certainly not if you could avoid it, right? Okay, so how does that apply to Socrates? Well, he's not worried about harming his body, right? He's worried about harming the part of oneself, as they put it, that is benefited by justice and corrupted by injustice. Surely he means the soul, right? We have to be careful using that word here in this context, but that does seem to be what Socrates is talking about. I say we need to be careful because Socrates is a pagan. Christianity doesn't exist, so we're used to thinking of souls as immortal, created by God, capital G. That wouldn't be Socrates' view. We already know he's agnostic about the afterlife. That's what he says in the Apology, right? So he does have a soul. He has a rich inner life, let's say. He has to live with himself. And so what he's saying is, if I do something terribly unjust, I'll be bothered. I'll sort of torture myself. I'll have regrets. I don't want to live like that, right? That's bad for my quality of life. So that's the parallel to this athlete, right? This athlete could corrupt his or her body, doing the pommel horse the wrong way. I could corrupt my soul if I handle this execution situation in the wrong way. I don't want to destroy my soul and then have to live with a corrupted soul, right? So the good life is to be preferred. over mere life, right? So this argument supports all of the principles that they've been going over. Listen to the good opinions. Why? Because there's expertise there that will preserve your body and soul. Um, you don't want to just go on living no matter what, right? Because there's a quality of life issue. You don't want to live with a corrupted soul or a corrupted body. And then we've also now explained why harm is done to the wrongdoer and not just the victim, right? It's bad for your soul. Okay. At this point, Socrates seems to have arrived at this anti-consequentialist position. Okay, in other words, never mind the consequences, I have to do what's right, I have to do what's just. Okay, in ethics, people argue about whether we should determine what's right or what's wrong based on the consequences, or whether we need some other way to arrive at the moral rules, and then we have to follow the rules, whatever the consequences may be, right? So the consequentialist position seems to leave a lot of wiggle room. Well, there are all these possible consequences. We'd better consider them carefully and weigh them against each other. The anti-consequentialist position seems to be more absolute. Well, the rule is the rule. Doesn't matter that there might be harm involved in following the rule. We have reason to think this is the correct rule. We have to do it. There's something common sense about both positions, right? You wouldn't think we should ignore harms and benefits when we determine what's right and wrong, but then on the other hand, we do tend to say, well, you must do your duty. Whatever your moral duty is, you must do it. That doesn't seem to allow for saying, oh, but it'll impact me in this negative way, right? We tend to think that's not really relevant, and so that's the direction Socrates is going in, right? Maybe this doesn't fit in well with some other dialogues that Plato wrote, actually, but that's what seems to be going on here. Socrates has said, even before Crito and Socrates actually reaffirmed their principles, Socrates noted, well, if we do reaffirm them, if we do agree on our prior principles, right, we will see that these considerations you have brought up, Crito, are not relevant. Okay, that I'm going to die is not relevant. Whatever harms Athens, might throw at me, they don't matter. Okay, the expense of escaping isn't relevant. Even bringing up children properly, there's a little bit of nuance here if you look at the whole dialogue, but Socrates does straightforwardly say this issue of bringing up my children is beside the point. I mean, there's this absolute line that I shouldn't cross. So he owes us an argument for that. We haven't actually gotten to the argument yet. But it is important to note that seems to be where Socrates has ended up. He must do the just thing. He must do the right thing. The consequences are neither here nor there. The question remaining ahead of us is, well, can he give a successful argument that this is the right thing to do, to let himself be executed? The nuance with his children is, again, looking at the text as a whole, he does seem to concede he has duties toward them, which is good, because I'm sure he does. But his position is, well, I could escape, right? And then What? Would I take my children on the run with me? Well, I don't think so. Athens has really great educational institutions, and I don't want my children to be on the run, so they're going to stay in Athens. So I have to depend on my friends to raise them properly. I'm not going to be around, right? So then I can't use them as an excuse. So presumably Socrates sees that, yeah, I have duties toward my children, but they're not actually relevant. They're not going to trump this duty to accept my just punishment here. Okay, and all of this is set up to talk about just agreements and what kind of agreement Socrates has with the state, right? So, Socrates asks Crito a general question. Look, should you stick to your agreements or what? And it's easy for Crito to answer that question, the general one. Well, of course you should stick to your just agreements. Right, you're not allowed to renege. Socrates and Crito have already agreed. You can't do wrongdoing out of retaliation to get revenge. Right, that's not allowable. So whatever else happens, you need to stick to your just agreements. So now Socrates raises this essential question that's key to the whole dialogue. Look, am I sticking to my just agreement if I escape? Or am I violating a just agreement that I have made if I escape? What do you think, Crito? Crito is confused. So you've made an agreement with the laws of Athens? Gosh, Socrates, I didn't know you had done that. Right? So he says, I don't know what you mean, Socrates. I don't know if you're violating a just agreement if you escape. I don't know who this agreement is with. I don't know the nature of the agreement. Okay. So Socrates is now going to speak on behalf of the laws, right? And maybe we should look at this in the text here. Right, so at 50a, let's go ahead and quote Crito here. I cannot answer your question, Socrates. I do not know, right? He's saying it's not the general question anymore. Should you stick to your just agreements? It's a more specific question. Are we still sticking to a just agreement if we escape? I don't know what agreement you have in mind, Socrates. Socrates says, look at it this way. If, as we were planning to run away from here, or whatever one should call it, the laws and the state came and confronted us and asked, tell me, Socrates, what are you intending to do? Do you not by this action you are attempting intend to destroy us, the laws, and indeed the whole city, as far as you are concerned? Or do you think it possible for a city not to be destroyed if the verdicts of its courts have no force, but are nullified and set at naught by private individuals? What shall we answer to this and other such arguments? Okay. So I would say there's a little bit of a digression here, but that's okay, we're getting there. So Crito doesn't know what Socrates is asking. So then he brings up this issue of harm. So the laws come and they talk to Socrates, theoretically, hypothetically, however you want to put that. And they say, what are you intending to do, right? Why are you willing to harm the city in this way, right? So on the one hand, we're building up to the issue of an agreement. We're getting there. On the other hand, it is worth pointing out that okay, well, Socrates and Crito have agreed never harm anyone, never engage in wrongdoing, even in retaliation. So it is important, even though it's not properly speaking part of the argument from agreement, it is important to note that Socrates is saying, I would harm the city as much as it's in my power, Maybe I don't have the power to completely destroy it, but I would do what I could to harm it by escaping. Right? And you can see how that works. I mean, he says it in what we just read. I would be showing with my action that it's okay to disregard the law, and then specifically the law that says the verdicts of the courts shall be carried out. And I'm a prominent person. He doesn't say that explicitly here, but it seems to be part of what he's getting at. People look to me for wisdom. For some reason, they think I'm wise. So there are eyes on me. Aren't I communicating to people that it's okay to just disregard the laws by escaping, right? So that's a harm. That harms everybody to the extent that we need law and order to exist together. So we're not, again, but it seems like a bit of an aggression to me, but yeah, let's get that issue of harm in there. That's important. We've already established to Socrates and Crito's satisfaction that retaliation isn't allowed. But it does come up again, and I believe this is because now the laws are talking, and now the laws are going to weigh in on the issue of whether it's okay to retaliate. So the text is a bit weird, I admit, but anyway, this issue of retaliation is raised again, even though Crito and Socrates have clearly agreed it's not okay to retaliate. You can't justify an apparently wrong action by saying, well, I was retaliating, I was trying to get back at someone. Okay, but Socrates does ask Crito, is that what I should tell the laws? Shall I tell the laws that I was wronged by the Athenians, so I don't really have to take my punishment, right? And Crito initially says, yeah, tell them that, right? But now the laws are going to weigh in on retaliation, and initially the laws say, well, what did you agree to, Socrates? Did you agree to obey some laws but not others? Did you agree to obey under certain conditions but not under other conditions? Or did you just agree to obey, right? And Socrates is suggesting that he has just agreed to obey, and although we still haven't gotten that argument, before the laws get to the issue of agreement, they try to deal with this retaliation issue. Look, is there a right of retaliation or isn't there? They argue by comparing themselves to Socrates' parents and those who raised Socrates. They do make it explicit that those are two different comparisons they're making. Okay, so you're not necessarily raised by the people who brought you into existence, right? So we could talk about your progenitors or your bio-parents, and then we could talk about the people who raised you, and Socrates is making that distinction. Okay, so first of all, the laws say, we brought you into this world, and we can take you out. They do kind of say that. They say we're responsible for your existence. We allowed your mom and dad to marry, after all. And if we flesh that out a little bit, right, it's not very well fleshed out in the text. What I think we should focus on is it's a big deal to be a citizen. Okay, so mom and dad don't have to be married to procreate, obviously. However, a citizen has a full set of rights that are almost certainly going to be upheld and enforced, and someone who can't show citizenship, unfortunately, we're seeing some examples of this, they might not be treated very well, they might not get their due process, right? So in Athens, your mom and dad have to be citizens and they have to get legally married, and then you can be a citizen as a result of that, right? Their citizenship is established and their legal marriage is established, and then you can be a citizen. So it's a big deal that Socrates exists as a citizen of Athens, and in a sense, the laws have given birth to him as a citizen. I believe that's the main issue here. And then, on top of that, the laws raised Socrates in a way, they made him learn his Homer, and they made him do gymnastics, so they made him cultivate his mind and his body, so they're responsible for the man he has become. So what should his relationship to them be? Well, according to these two different lines of argument, since we have two different comparisons, according to this, he should defer to them, right? And should he retaliate against them if they try to punish him? Well, no, it's not that kind of relationship, right? When your parents were raising you, they had the right, the authority to punish you, and you didn't have the right to punish them. It's an uneven relationship, so that's what the analogies are meant to establish. This isn't a relationship of equality, it's a different kind of relationship. It's the kind in which you defer and it has the authority. The laws have the authority. So there's something to that. I don't think it's really as satisfying as the argument from agreement, but it makes some sense as far as it goes. Right? So the laws say you're our child and slave. He's not literally their slave, right? Again, what they're saying is it's an analogy. They're saying it's a certain kind of relationship in which we have more authority than you. It's not reciprocal. It's not equal. We dictate things to you and you defer, and you could persuade us. You could try to persuade us. There are legal avenues for that, is what they're getting at, right? But it also seems like those avenues have been exhausted, right? Socrates could have gone to the assembly and tried to change the laws at any point in the last 69 years or whatever, and he didn't do it, and then he had a trial, and he could have persuaded the laws at that point and was not successful. So he had his shot at persuasion. That shot has ended, it's over. So doesn't he now have to do what they say? And, again, there's no right of retaliation, right? If you really don't have an even or equal or reciprocal relationship with the laws and you must defer to them, which maybe is the only way we could get society to work. Socrates never says that, but it's something that seems to keep coming up here, right? It is an issue when we talk about harming society or harming Athens, right? Well, what kind of harm? Well, if you show that verdicts of the courts can be just set aside, discarded, you're opening up the door for chaos, right? So tangentially, that the issue is somewhere in here, right? We need law and order. Okay, so we need this relationship to be uneven. We need the laws to have more authority than any individual has. So if that's where we are, if we say that's the kind of relationship it is, then this is correct. Socrates does not have a right of retaliation. The laws have a right to punish him. He doesn't have a right to punish the laws. Okay, so at least to that extent, the argument seems to work, even if we don't like the analogies, even if, we don't think you always have to listen to your parents. The Greeks were very big on that. It doesn't work as well in our culture. But we could see why even if we don't agree with the analogies, this can't be a reciprocal relationship in which the individual and the laws have the same amount of authority. That doesn't seem to work. Okay, and I won't spend time on this, but Socrates does bring up once again the idea that he must stay at his post. I already talked about that with connection to the Apology, so don't need to go over it again here. Clearly, if you must stay at your post, then you must stay at your post, whatever harms or dangers are coming your way. Now we finally get to contract theory. We get to some kind of abstract argument to show that Socrates has agreed. So we've been building up to this for a while, right? There's been this issue of whether Socrates has agreed, whether there's a just agreement between himself and the laws. He seems to have already stated there's some kind of agreement he would be violating if he escaped. Okay, well now we're finally going to flesh it out. Okay? And the initial point is pretty simple, actually. The laws point out that if you don't like Athens, if you're dissatisfied with the laws, well, you can leave. As long as you're an adult, you can leave, right? So, again, if you don't like the setup, if you don't like how the laws operate, you could go. So then that seems to imply that if you stay, you are satisfied, right? So it seems like if you stay, you're consenting to this system. Now, granted, maybe you don't like the alternatives. Still, you're consenting to this one, this option, right? And saying it's better than the others. So I don't think it matters, that you're just choosing it over other possible places you could go. The consent makes sense, right? That you give consent by staying, at least if you're an adult. If you're a kid, it's different. You can't really just walk off and leave your parents behind. Perhaps, probably. Right, but if you're an adult, you could go. Therefore, if you don't go, if you stay, then you've consented. Okay, pretty clear. Also pretty clear that this applies to Socrates. He didn't leave. Here he is, right? All this time, he didn't leave. So now he's supposed to take his punishment. So now if he leaves, it's wrongdoing, right? So it wouldn't have been anything wrong all this time up until he was rounded up. He wasn't really rounded up. He came to trial voluntarily, it seems. Anyway, all this time until the trial was scheduled, he could have gone. Now it would be wrong. So he stayed long enough to consent to this whole system of governance that then found him guilty and sentenced him to death. And so now he's got an obligation to see it through and take his punishment. That seems right as far as it goes. The laws handle some objections, They try to nip some possible objections in the bud. How do they do that? Well, for instance, they talk about how Athenians get to participate in governance. In particular, they get to go see how the trials are run, right? How do trials actually work? How do people get found guilty? What kinds of sentences do they get after they're found guilty, right? So Socrates could have gone and looked at a lot of trials. I don't know how much he did that. It doesn't seem like he's around law courts very much, but there was an audience at his trial, right? So you can just go watch and be an audience member. So that raises the issue of transparency. And I say that the laws are dealing with possible objections, because you could object to any contract by saying that the language wasn't clear, that the parties didn't know what they were agreeing to. That's always a fair complaint, right? If you could establish that, well, this person couldn't have known what he or she was agreeing to. Look at this garbled language, right? That does invalidate the contract, or it could, depends on the part that's garbled or what's at stake, but that's a legitimate complaint in any case, right? So the laws are trying to show that valid complaint doesn't hold. Socrates knew what he was agreeing to. We could also add that, well, he got to participate in the assembly, so he got to go see how legislation was actually made, right? He also had some kind of power to participate there. So that persuasion issue comes up again. Well, that was an opportunity to persuade the laws, also an opportunity to see how they operate. Okay, and then the laws say, not one of us forbids an Athenian from leaving, right? Again, if they're an adult, meaning nobody's being coerced here. Nobody's being forced to stay. Athens is an open society, unlike some of the city-states around it. So there's no law that says you can't leave, or you have to meet all these conditions to leave. It's kind of easy to go in and out, right? That's why Athens was subject to those plagues, right? We talked about this, how Sparta is a somewhat closed society, Athens is open. So it's kind of vulnerable in ways that Sparta isn't, and yeah, it's easy to come and go. Okay, so that handles a possible objection that he was constrained or he was coerced somehow. No, he's free to go. The laws say you could even take your property if you go, which apparently wasn't true in Sparta, right? It thought that it owned the property, and so even if you could go, and I'm not sure you could, I'm not exactly a scholar on the ancient world or anything, but even if you could go, if you could find a way to leave Sparta and they would let you go live somewhere else, you'd have to leave your things behind. But in Athens, you could take them with you, right? So Socrates knew what he was agreeing to. He's in no way coerced or constrained. So he consented. He consented to these laws. He could have gone. He really could have gone, and he didn't go. So hasn't he agreed then? Well, I'm inclined to say yes, but okay, we should mention that. Well, his consent wasn't explicit? I mean, if we're looking for the best kind of consent, it would be explicit consent, right? You sign your name to an actual written contract. Well, he didn't do that, right? But is there such a thing as implicit consent? Well, of course there is. I mean, I used to do this when I taught in person. I would actually pause in class and I would say, okay, so we've read the syllabus and you're here. So, I didn't have you sign the syllabus, but haven't you agreed to abide by the syllabus? Haven't you agreed to get a certain kind of grade if you don't do what the syllabus says? And by the way, I would kind of wink at him or make a face. You could go now if you don't abide by the syllabus. If you don't want to abide by the syllabus, excuse me. Now's your chance to go. Nobody ever left at that point. So kind of unrealistic. Bit of a joke, but in actuality, they could go at that point, at that very point, right? They could say, oh yeah, I could leave. Nothing's making me stay here. I don't like the syllabus, as a matter of fact. So I'm out of here, right? Anyway, it does make the point that I want to make here, which is that, well, sometimes agreement is implied, right? It's easy enough to drop a course. The instructor is told, you know, give the students the syllabus right away. There are mechanisms in place to make sure the instructor does that. I had to give my syllabus to the administrative assistant for the philosophy department. Okay, that's a requirement. Things start, sanctions start going into motion if I don't turn in the syllabus like I'm supposed to. It's never come up. I'm happy to give the syllabus out, just to be clear. My point again is, yes, implicit consent. That still is consent. It's not the best kind. The laws would have a better case if Socrates had signed a contract, but he really was free to leave, and he knew what the rules were, and he didn't leave, and so, seems like he's bound. So I do have on this slide, well, what about moral limitations? Like, what if the state said, if you don't drive on the right side of the road, we will put you to death? Right? If you don't drive on the right side of the road, you get ticketed, right? I guess if the police knew you were doing it deliberately, if they had reason to think it was deliberate, then that's reckless endangerment, and that could be more than a ticket. But if you get caught driving on the left side of the road, the police are probably going to think you're confused, and the worst case is you get a fine, right? But what if they put you to death? Is that okay? Can you really consent to that? Does that even make any sense? In theory, you could consent, but I could see why you might say that consent is not really legitimate, right? Because it's such a crazy demand. So maybe it's not the case that you could consent to any system of government, but then Socrates never says that, does he? Right? He consented to a fairly democratic government where his participation was somewhat assumed, right? So he wasn't consenting to tyranny or anything. The charges that he got tried on were weird, but not obviously immoral, like executing people for driving on the right side of the road. In other words, we can see why we wouldn't want people to corrupt the youth. It's harder for us to see why people should be pious, I suppose. We believe in separation of church and state, but all I can say there is, well, the Greeks didn't believe in that, and I suppose Socrates could have argued for separation of church and state, but he never did argue for that. And anyway, if we want to hone in on what exactly the consent concerns more than anything else, Socrates does mention a specific law, and I've already mentioned it, as a matter of fact. What about the law that the verdicts of the courts must be carried out, right? We worry about that in the United States right now. Is everybody, I'll just leave it at that, is everybody going to abide by the court's rulings, right? It's not always clear what a law means. It's not always clear how the Constitution applies. We have to have a referee. We have to have an arbiter. Otherwise, we don't even know what the law is. The verdicts of the courts have to be carried out. Otherwise, the law doesn't exist in a sense. The courts have to decide how these laws actually get applied. They're the referees. Okay, so Specifically, surely Socrates has agreed that the verdicts of the courts shall be carried out, right? Yes, it seems right. So the verdict of the court shall be carried out, right, per Socrates' own agreement and consent. The laws summarize their case at 51e. I didn't put that on the slide, but if you want to see this and where it is, it's 51e. We've already been over all this. The reason I show that they made this summary, the reason I want you to think about it is I do want you to keep the analogies separate from the issue of consent. If you look at 51e, you'll see that the laws are careful to distinguish these things. In other words, the laws are like Socrates' progenitors. The laws are like Socrates' upbringers, the people who raised him. Those are separate from each other, and those are separate from the point that Socrates has consented. Right, so look at 51e if you're not sure. I think it's not a good idea to mix these considerations, so I'm warning you in case we have to write a discussion post or a paper about it. The thing is, you didn't agree to have certain parents. You didn't agree to be raised by certain people. You know, that would be a very unusual case, at least maybe if you're 10 and you choose among two different families who are trying to adopt you. It could happen, right? But generally speaking, you certainly don't choose your progenitors. You don't consent to them. And you don't choose the people who raise you, generally speaking. There's not an issue of consent there. So we need to keep that separate from this argument that says Socrates has consented to obey. Okay, so that's the only reason I would want you to really look at this summary and think about it. The laws definitely treat these lines of argument as separate, and I think if you mix them together, things get pretty muddled. Okay, there are some considerations that are special to Socrates. So we've had a general argument, right, for consent. The general argument is adult Athenians could leave. So if they haven't left, they've consented. There's transparency. They get to see how the government works. There's no coercion. They're free to go. But there's some ad hominem reasoning, we could call it. I don't know if that's the greatest title in the world, but it's to the person. That's what ad hominem means. So that's the name of a fallacy, but I'm not saying the laws commit a fallacy. I'm saying that there are some special considerations when it comes to Socrates. So all the adult Athenians have consented, it seems like, but Socrates especially has consented. And there seem to be 4 different points that show that Socrates especially has consented. He's barely left the city, the laws say. And of course, this is actually Socrates speaking, so I will take his word for it. He's barely left the city. He doesn't really like to leave. He likes to go around asking Athenians questions. So yeah, he doesn't have a strong desire to just roam through the Greek countryside. He wants to be in Athens and interrogate people. He believes the god told him to do that. Okay, so that's number 1. Number 2, he has had children in Athens. And he had them later in life too, right? He says he's got some young, none of them is an adult. He's got 3 sons who aren't adults yet, and he's about 70. So you can tell that he had children later in life. So he had an opportunity to think about whether it was a good idea to have children in Athens. So presumably there was a thought there that this is a good place to have children, right? So he's consented more than people who haven't had children in Athens. He could have argued for exile at his trial. Remember, he argued against exile instead. So he could have said at his trial, yes, why don't you just exile me? I think the jury would have taken him up on that offer, right? But he said, other places won't be able to stand me. If you fellow Athenians don't like me, and I can't just go somewhere and shut up because the god told me to philosophize. So exile's no good, right? Okay, so he could have asked for exile and he didn't. And then number 4, yeah, he's old. It's no secret. He's about 70. Okay, I think he's 69, but whatever. He's about 70. He's had a lot of time. He's had more time than most Athenians to think about whether he wants to leave, and he hasn't left. So Socrates is particularly attached to Athens. So the level of consent, the degree of consent is high. Right, so I don't know if we want to make these fine distinctions. We could just say adult Athenians have consented, but the laws go ahead anyway and say your level of consent or your degree of consent was pretty high, Socrates. Now there are these further considerations against escape. I don't really want to read them all. I will point out that the laws give Socrates this conundrum. They say, well, if you go to a poorly governed state, you're not going to like it. There's going to be a lot of license and chaos, and you're not going to like how things go there, right? You want things to be well ordered. You respect how well ordered Athens is. You don't want to go to one of these other places where the laws aren't really enforced and maybe people don't even know what the laws are. That's bad for your quality of life. There's been a lot of talk about quality of life in this dialogue without using that phrase. So here it is again. Your quality of life won't be so good if you go to a disordered state. And then on the other hand, if you go to a well-ordered state, they're likely to kick you out. You're a fugitive. Why would they want you there? They'll tell you to move on. So then what? You're a vagabond moving from state to state. Okay. So the main thing I want to say about all these considerations is they sound awfully consequentialist. Certainly the two I just stated sound like problematic consequences, right? So you might think, well, how does that fit with the anti-consequentialist stance from earlier? Well, maybe not everybody would agree that there was an anti-consequentialist stance, but I stand by that. I think it's very clear. So I have to offer an interpretation of what's going on here. I believe what's going on here is, look, we already had the main arguments. There were 3 of them. Remember, the laws explicitly summarized their case and said, if you escape, you've done us wrong in these 3 distinct ways. You know, you've gone against the people who gave birth to you. You've gone against the people who raised you, and then you've disobeyed even though you agreed to obey. So my take on this is those are the arguments of the wise. They came from the laws when the laws initially began to address this issue of whether Socrates could escape. I think where we are at this point is the laws are saying, here are these other things to think about if you don't want to listen to our expert opinion. So I think we're past the point of the expert opinion, and now the laws are talking to Socrates as if he's intransigent, as if he's not listening or cooperating, right? If you don't want to take our sound advice, if you don't want to listen to us as experts, consider these bad things that will happen if you escape. So that's what I think is going on. I don't think we've gone back on this being an overall anti-consequentialist text. I think that we did have three arguments that weren't really consequentialist in their outlook, right? And then those were the main case. Again, the laws seemed to pause and summarize their case and say, this is how you've done wrong. And so then these considerations are to sort of steel Socrates' soul in case he's not willing to listen to the best considerations. These are stopgap measures or fail-safes or something like that. These are for the person who doesn't listen to the best advice. Okay, so I don't know, you have to think about whether that works. To me, it makes sense of the text and what's going on here. Finally, there is a potential inconsistency between the Apology and the Crito when you take them together, right? So in the Apology, Socrates says, I'm going to keep philosophizing even if you order me not to, right? So that's difficult. That sounds like the disregarding of the court's verdict, right? And then in the Crito, he's saying, well, I have to do what the court says and ensure that the verdicts are carried out, and so if I have to die, I have to die. On the face of it, that looks problematic. However, one way to approach it, this isn't the way everybody approaches it, but the way that I look at it is, well, remember, Apollo ordered Socrates to philosophize, right? So the Crito isn't necessarily saying always obey the state no matter what it says and no matter what's at stake. You don't have to read it as that strong. It could be that unless there's a countermanding consideration that overrides what the state is saying, then you have to do what the state says. Now, Apollo, as I already said, ordered Socrates to philosophize, or that's what he believes. If anything could override the state's authority, it would be, a command from the god. So I think what's going on is Socrates was ordered to philosophize by a god, so even if the city says quit philosophizing, he will disregard that specific order, right? Because the god is a higher authority. As for, what's going on in the Crito, couple different things. The god isn't ordering him to escape, that's for certain, right? You might think, well, the god has ordered him to philosophize. He can't philosophize if he's executed. Therefore, isn't the god telling him to escape? No, I don't think that's right. I think there are a couple of things there. One of the things that comes up in the Crito is Socrates says, who's gonna listen to me? Right? If I escape, if I'm a fugitive and I try to philosophize outside of Athens, my words will ring hollow. Right? So divine mission aside, Socrates can see that philosophizing won't be so valuable anymore. It's been valuable. He's been able to see the value of it himself. He can also see that it will lose its value if he tries to go tell people about virtue when he's an escaped convict. It's not going to work. Another thing to consider is the dream. Socrates had a dream. A woman in white came to him and said, you'll arrive in fertile Phthia on the third day. He acts as if the gods are talking to him, and that's a conventional Greek thing to do, as I already mentioned. Socrates is being portrayed as conventionally pious when he takes this dream seriously, right? So I believe that he takes this as a communication from the gods that it's okay, it's time to go. So he can't be ordered to philosophize and then at the same time told it's time to let go. So the most recent communication from the gods is let it go, let it be, right? So we don't necessarily like it, right? Saying that the god is a higher authority could allow for some fanaticism, right? But I think there's a consistent view here. In general, you have to do what the state says because you've agreed to do what the state says. Also, your relationship with the state is not reciprocal, right? Now, maybe a god could order you to do something and then you have to do it even if the state is giving you an opposite order. That makes sense. We may not like it, but I do believe there's not really an inconsistency here. I think this can be worked out. Okay, so on that note, we will let the text be, right? We will let it go. We will leave the Crito now, and our next stop will be the Euthyphro. That's what we're going to look at in week 3. All right, thanks for watching.